Hey everyone, so due to popular demand, we're going to continue the Glad You Asked midweek questions because there are so many questions that you are still asking. There are so many questions that haven't been formally asked of me, but I know you're asking. I know culture is asking. I am asking. And so we want to continue digging deep into these questions and giving you the tools to navigate these complex questions and the complexities of life around us. We may not always get around to doing this on a weekly basis, but as the questions come up and as we have opportunity, we're going to try put out videos to equip you to wrestle with these questions. So the question I'm dealing with today is definitely the question that required the most research from me. It's going to be the longest video that you put out so far. And I really want to invite you to commit to watching the entire video because I promise you, you will ask this question if you haven't already, or someone else is going to ask this question of you. And I want you to be prepared to deal with what comes your way. So one of my favorite taste combinations when it comes to food is prawns and chorizo sausage. So whether that's in a seafood pot or a seafood rice or a paella or on a Portuguese plate of food, I just think those are flavors that are meant to be put together, a combo made in heaven. But there's one problem with that. And the problem is the Bible expressly tells me that I'm not allowed to eat shellfish and I'm not allowed to eat pork. So what do I do with that? Because I try and eat that as often as I possibly can. Am I breaking the law? Am I offending God? Am I going against the Bible? A very similar kind of tension that comes up regularly is the whole issue around tattoos. A friend of mine recently, someone who loves God and follows Jesus just radically, she has some tattoos and something about that came up on social media and this debate started kind of unfolding and I started getting increasingly just upset with how the debate was going because it just wasn't gracious. It was quite ignorant for the most part. And, many Christians were just chiming in saying, but the Bible says that we cannot have tattoos, the end. So what do we do with these issues? What do we do with these laws? How do I read them? And how do I decide how I'm going to live my Christian life today? Now, for those of you who don't know where this conversation is coming from, we're talking about all the laws we find in the Old Testament, specifically in what is known as the Torah, the first 5 books of the Bible, otherwise known as the law. We'll come back to that in a second. But there's a whole lot of laws that we don't always know what to do. Maybe you've done one of these read through the Bible in a year kind of plans, and so you get to Genesis and you're like, creation, I know about that. Adam and Noah and Abraham and Moses, and then we get to the book of Exodus and we've seen movies about the book of Exodus and we're happy with those stories, and then we get to the book of Leviticus and even parts of Exodus and we just get all these random laws like, yes, I can't eat shellfish, or I can't eat pork, I can't wear 2 types of cloths like I'm doing right now, and we get confused. And some of you just press pause and you skip forward to the stories you're more familiar with, or you go straight to the New Testament, which isn't a bad idea. And yet for others, you're looking at these laws and you're like, what do I do with them? Do I obey them? So the first thing that we need to do is actually understand the context in which we find these biblical laws. I mentioned earlier that they're found in the first 5 books of the Old Testament, known as the Torah, which we translate as law. Most often in the New Testament, when it's talking about the Torah, it's calling it law. And so what we do, we read the New Testament, we see the word law, and then we import our understanding of modern legal practices into that word law. Mistake number 1. Then we import that understanding back into the first 5 books of the Bible, and we are just finding ourselves in a very confused state. So now the word Torah is often translated as law, but many scholars have said, is that the best translation? Some have said maybe it should be better translated as instruction or teaching or guidance. Now, while there are many laws in the Torah, there's 613 laws in the Torah, most of the Torah is actually made up of story. And so it's not like there are stories and then law, and then stories and then law. Even the stories are instruction to us. Even the stories are there to train us and to guide us in the ways of God. And so let's look at how these stories came into being, specifically these laws. So going right back to Genesis chapter 12, God is wanting to grow a nation that he is going to bless, and through which he wants to bless all the nations of the world. And the way he does this is by starting with a single family, the family of Abraham. They moved from Ur into what will later become the promised land. He has a son, Isaac, and then Isaac has two children, Jacob and Esau. Jacob is the kind of son of promise. Jacob is the one that the promises of God are going to go through. And then Jacob has this really incredible story where his name is changed from Jacob to Israel. And so in a sense, Israel are the descendants of Jacob, and therefore the descendants of Isaac, and therefore ultimately Abraham. So Jacob has all of these kids. One of those kids' name is Joseph, and through a whole lot of interesting stories and events that I don't have time to get to, Joseph finds himself in Egypt, estranged from his family who have betrayed him. He becomes the number one power apart from Pharaoh in the land of Egypt. God tells them there's going to be a huge famine coming to this part of the world, and so Joseph starts preparing storehouses for this famine. The famine hits that part of the world. Egypt is prepared, but Israel is not. And so Israel, again, we're just talking about a family, a small family, about 70 people move from what will later be the nation of Israel. They move into Egypt, and they start to reconcile with their brother Joseph, and they settle down, and they just enjoy the benefits of Joseph's planning. What starts to happen is that this family of roughly 70 people start to have kids and multiply and have kids and multiply. They stay there for a number of centuries. And so this Pharaoh comes and goes, another Pharaoh comes and goes. Eventually, there are pharaohs who have no idea why these Israelites are there. These people have grown to become a small nation. The Pharaoh is so intimidated by them that he says what we need to do is enslave them. So he enslaves the small nation of Israelites, and then we get to Moses, the famous story where God uses Moses to miraculously free his people out of slavery and out of bondage. They have been in Egypt for 400 years. They came in as a family, and they're leaving as a nation. Now they're going to head towards a piece of ground, what we call the promised land. But as a people group, they are effectively a nation. And what do nations need? They need laws. While they were in Egypt, they would have had some idea of Abraham and Isaac and all that kind of thing, but they didn't have the laws as we have them in the Old Testament yet. All right, so while they were in Egypt, they would have probably obeyed Egyptian law, but now they're leaving the land of Egypt. They're about to be established as a nation, and so they need laws. So they get to Mount Sinai soon after leaving Egypt, and this is what God says to them. You yourselves have seen what I did to Egypt and how I carried you on eagle's wings and brought you to myself. Now, if you obey me fully and keep my covenant is a promise. It's even more important than a contract, but basically two parties are coming together and they're committing to do something together. If you obey me fully and keep my covenant, then it's very important to notice this. If you obey me and keep my covenant, then out of all of the nations, you will be my treasured possession. Although the whole earth is mine, you will be for me a kingdom of priests and a holy nation. And so Moses is coming to the people saying, guys, God wants to make us into a nation. All right, but here's the deal. Not only is he going to give us laws in order that we can govern ourselves, but there is going to be a special relationship that we're going to have with God. There is this if-then thing that if we keep to the laws of the covenant, then we will be this treasured nation. Guys, are you up for this? And the people say, yes, we will do everything that the Lord commands. This, many scholars have pointed out, is almost like a marriage ceremony where husband and wife come together saying, we will be loyal to you and to you alone. And this is what Israel is promising to God, and God therefore will be loyal to them and bless them mightily. So then Moses then goes up the mountain and he starts receiving the law. He went up the mountain several times in order to receive kind of several installations of the law. So here's the first big question, and I'm hoping this is clear to you now. Who are these laws for? These laws, I'm hoping you're seeing, are for the nation of Israel. And these laws are going to ultimately do two things for them. They're going to enable them to do kind of civil life. These laws are going to govern their way of life, just like we need laws and the US needs laws, and all countries have needed some sets of laws. So they need those kinds of laws. And there's a whole set of laws that are going to nurture and protect this very unique relationship that they're going to have with their God. So we immediately see that these laws were for this nation, for this very unique period of time. These laws were never for the Gentile nations. They were never meant to export these laws. They had their own laws. God never judged the Gentile nations according to these unique covenantal laws between God and Israel. Even when God's salvation went to the Gentile nations, like when Jonah went to Nineveh, they repented, they believed. Jonah didn't follow up by bringing in the Old Testament or the Old Covenant law. When Daniel and them were operating in Babylon, they were quite happy to live according to the civil laws of Babylon. They kind of followed some of their own laws as well, but they didn't try export Jewish law into Babylon. These laws were for the nation of Israel and their life and their covenants. So a modern kind of way of thinking about this is this. Do I need to obey UK laws? Well, I live in South Africa, and so the answer is, as long as I am in South Africa, I need to obey South African laws. When I go to the UK, then of course I need to obey their laws. Now, there are going to be some similarities. For example, murder is forbidden in both the UK and in South Africa. So if I obey the law of do not murder, is that because of the UK law? No, it is because of the South African law. So if a foreigner had to come and live in Israel at the time, of course they had to obey all of those laws. And in the same way, if there are laws that we find, or instructions or kind of moral imperatives that we find in the New Testament, even though they may be the same as some of those in the Old Testament, we don't obey them because they're in the Old Testament. We obey them because they're taught by Christ and the apostles, and it is for that reason that we try live according to those ways. So here's the funny thing, going back to the nation of Israel. Moses goes up the mountain and he gets the first installment of laws. And the first two are quite famous. We are only to worship one God. And number two, they were not to make any idols. What happens? Moses comes down and they have already broken the first two laws. Now just remember the timeline here. God has just demonstrated his power in such a powerful, miraculous way, taking them out of slavery, leading them towards this brand new future, and they can't even fulfill the first two laws. And we actually just see that on repeats. Moses goes up, gets some laws, comes down, and the people break the laws. Moses goes up, gets some more laws, comes down, and people break the laws. We just immediately start seeing this pattern that while there is this law and this guidance, the people just are not able to completely and faithfully fulfill the law and therefore their side of their covenant with God. So once again, these laws were for Israel. They're not for us to obey. I once read about a funny story about a guy who tried to, in inverted commas, live biblically, and he, who was not a Christian, he tried to live according to all the laws of the Torah, every single one of them, even the laws to kind of stone adulterers. So what he would do, he would take tiny little stones and throw them at his friends after he knew they were watching porn. He also found out he could not live according to these laws. Just practically, it was impossible, proving the same kind of point that we've seen here. But in order to more understand the context of these laws, let's take a deeper dive. Let's try and understand these laws. And what we see is that these laws loosely fall into a number of different categories. Category 1 is criminal law. Now, I know that most of you have seen one of the Law and Order series, and that is where we see criminal law on display. And every nation needs criminal law. Every nation needs to know what is permitted. How do I live according to this? What can I and what can't I do? And what happens if I break the law? And what we see in these laws is that there are penalties for breaking the law. And some of the penalties were actually capital punishments. And while I know that's kind of a hotly debated topic, we need to understand that, and we're going to come back to this a little bit more later on, that we're going back thousands of years, and most cultures for most of time had certain laws that if you transgressed them, that there was going to be a capital punishment for these offenses. When it comes to the Old Testament, the kind of offenses that carried a capital punishment were those more connected to the moral law, specifically either directly or indirectly connected to the Ten Commandments. All right, and remember, the covenant was not only to give them laws to govern their land, but also laws to protect their covenant relationship with God. And so God took this seriously, and they took this seriously. But this wasn't just random. People didn't just run around stoning people to death. This is one of the things that help us see just how just the laws of Israel were. There had to be witnesses, there had to be evidence, and this had to be adjudicated in some sort of court. When compared to the nations around them, while they also had legal codes, there was a lot more like arbitrariness to how capital punishments was handed out. It really came down to the mood of the king of the day. And so even in this criminal law set of laws, we see an incredible amount of justice, especially when compared to the nations around them. So there was criminal law, then there was moral law, and more famously, we know the Ten Commandments, things like do not kill, do not steal, do not commit adultery. And these are the laws that governed the moral life of Israel. And as we look around us, maybe some of us wonder if having a moral law of some sort wouldn't be an aid to us. And then, of course, just like you and I have, there was civil law. And these are laws that just help them manage disputes over land, over buildings. What happens if your dog bites me? What happens if my servant hits you? What happens if your cow runs through my field and damages my crops or gores my child? Just how do we handle all of these kinds of issues? And some of these civil laws seem really strange to us. And I want to come back to a point that I brought up earlier. Guys, we're talking about a period of history over 3,500 years ago. We make a big mistake when we import our kind of modern understanding of law and norms and things that make sense to us, and we compare 2021 understanding of law and civility, and we contrast it to these laws 3,500 years ago, and then we kind of judge that and we say, well, therefore it is so wrong, it is so bad. We need to understand that even in Western history, what is normal changes really, really quickly. I mean, if you go to the UK at the moment, there's a really strange law still in place that if you're a cabbie driver, you still need to have a bag of carrots in your trunk. Now, no one obeys that law, but that law was put in place because the original cabbie drivers had horses and carriages, and so the carrots were there to feed the horses. Now, that's only a matter of 100 or 200 years, I don't know exactly. We're now going back 3,500 years. The gap between what we think is normal and what these nations saw as normative is huge, and therefore we really need to humble ourselves when we try and evaluate what is going on back there. So we need to understand the context of these laws for Israel, but we also need to understand the context of these laws with regards to how these laws functioned in comparison to the surrounding nations. More recently, scholars have been able to uncover and study some of the laws in the surrounding nations, and what we see is two things. On one hand, we see a lot of commonality, showing that in many ways Israel wasn't really strange, but then we see certain pointed differences. All right, and this is where Israel stood out. And here was the point, not for you and I in 2021 to compare what we think is normative to what is happening 3,500 years ago, but for these nations to look at the laws of Israel and to say to themselves, I kind of see what's going on there. There's a lot in common between what they're doing and what we're doing, but I'm also noticing some marked differences. And the point was that these surrounding nations look into Israel and go, wow, that is what justice looks like. That is what wise governance looks like. And while today we kind of separate our religion from our governmental space, all right, we separate church and state, and so most of our nations are secular states. Back in the day, that wasn't the case. All right, so all of these nations were always all about their gods and which god was more powerful. And so the point was that they were to look at how Israel was governed, and not only to go, wow, Israel is wise, but to go, oh, wow, their God is wise. Their God is powerful. Their God is just, and God gets glory, which is often why so many of these laws don't make sense to us, but it made a whole lot of sense to them back there. All right, then we get family law, and these were laws governing how you did marriage and divorce and inheritance. Now, for you and I, even as Christians, when it comes to these kinds of things, we don't turn to the Old Testament. We look to the laws of our nation, and the nation of Israel needed laws to govern the sphere of life. Then there were compassionate laws. There were maybe not as much laws than just guidance. These were laws that, how do we look after the orphan? How do we look after the poor? How do we look after the widow or the alien or the stranger or the immigrant? And once again, we start to see that the nation of Israel had laws that were really so superior to the other nations when it came to children, when it came to women and wives and slaves and immigrants. They were an incredibly just nation, maybe not by your present day evaluation, but in comparison to those nations, there was an incredible display of justice in how they were to do life. And then finally, there was ceremonial law. Once again, we are secular states. We all kind of do religion in our private capacity. Not so for the nation of Israel. Remember, these laws were to govern not only their civil life, but also their covenantal life with God. Ceremonial law and religious life was literally at the center of the nation of Israel. I mean, quite literally, as they were moving towards the promised land, in the center of the camp was the tabernacle. And this just illustrates how you could not avoid and separate ceremonial law and religious life from the rest of life. For them, it was just one and the same thing. And so there's a whole lot of laws telling you what to do when it came to sacrifices and how did the priesthood work, and festivals and religious practices and feasts. And a lot of these laws were in place to kind of govern this part of religious life. Now, if you read this part of the book of Leviticus, you get to a whole set of strange laws that seem quite arbitrary to us, where they tell you, well, this is clean and that is unclean. This is clean and that is unclean. And this is really interesting. Firstly, you and I would be making a mistake if we interpret clean as morally good and unclean as morally bad or evil. Now, in some cases, we can maybe make that point, but the clean, unclean concept was very different to morally good versus morally evil, and it had more to do with the religious ceremonial way of being clean in the presence of God. Now, some of these laws have a lot of practical functionality. For example, they often talk about leprosy. It wasn't always leprosy per se, but any sort of skin disease. And so there are these clean, unclean guidelines. And if you get a boil, here's what to do. And there's all these guidelines as to kind of govern the hygiene of the nation of Israel. I mean, for example, there's some laws as to what to do when you find mildew in your tent. Now, this is long before science discovered the concept of microorganisms and how they work and how many of them are dangerous to us. And so God, in his wisdom, through these laws on mildew and through these laws on infectious skin diseases, was really protecting his nation. And once again, they were far advanced compared to the nations around them. But at the heart of this clean, unclean idea was this: God was the God of life. And anything that was somehow connected to anti-life, to death, was considered not necessarily always morally evil, but was considered unclean. So anything about blood, so whether it was a woman going through his cycle, or whether it was touching blood or semen, or my skin, there's something wrong with my skin, so there's an anti-life concept, or touching a dead animal made you ceremonially unclean. You had to go through these processes in order to become clean once again, so that you could be in the presence of the God of life. Now again, maybe that doesn't make sense to you, but to them that made a whole lot of sense. Now, under this category of ceremonial law also falls the food laws and the laws against shaving your sideburns and the laws against tattoos, because a lot of the surrounding nations kind of conflated tattoos with some of their idolatrous practices. So God wanted Israel to be separate from what is going on back there. And that is why when we understand the role of the law, we understand why we don't need to do some of these things. So finally, these laws were laws for the nation of Israel to govern all aspects of life, including their covenantal relationship with God. Now, let's move to the New Testament. For us as Christians, we are going to understand the New Testament as the interpretive lens for the Old Testament. And if you kind of started first page of the New Testament, it doesn't take you long before we find Jesus addressing how you and I are to understand the role of the Old Testament law and his relationship to the Old Testament law. And so let's read Matthew chapter 5 verses 17 to 18 to hear what Jesus had to say on this. And he says this: "Do not think that I have come to abolish the law or the prophets." Clearly, the kinds of things that Jesus was emphasizing made some people wonder, is he breaking from this several thousand-year-old tradition of the law? What's going on here? He was clearly being accused of these things. So he says, don't think that. He says, I have not come to abolish them, but to fulfill them. Who is called to fulfill them? Me? You? No, Jesus. I tell you the truth. Until heaven and earth disappear, not the smallest letter, not the least stroke of a pen, will by any means disappear from the law until everything is accomplished. So Jesus is going to fulfill the law. He is going to fulfill every single point of the law himself. That is one of the major things that the law is pointing towards. Now let me read one more passage and then let's talk about this briefly. Luke chapter 24 verses 27. Jesus is having a conversation with two disciples after his resurrection. And it says this, and beginning with Moses and all the prophets. So in other words, the entire New Testament, he explained to them what was said in all the scriptures concerning himself. So Matthew 5, Jesus is saying, I'm not abolishing the law. I'm here to fulfill every single letter of the law. Every single letter of the law. All right. Luke 24, he's talking about the entire scriptures, that they all point to him. They're all about him. So what does he mean by fulfilling the law, or that they all point towards him? Well, he's going to fulfill the law morally. We've already seen that whether you're a kind of New Testament Christian, or maybe a modern Jew, or a Jew from the Old Testament times, that just on repeat, we've demonstrated that we are unable to fulfill the law. Jesus lived the law and fulfilled it perfectly, but not only externally. He raises the stakes of the law. He says, listen, you've heard it said that you should not murder, but I say that if you're unnecessarily or unjustly angry with your brother in your heart, you are as guilty of murder as the one who murders. The same is true with adultery. And so when we understand that Jesus fulfilled the law morally, it wasn't only externally fulfilled, but Jesus didn't sin in his heart. The book of Hebrews tells us he was tempted just as you and I are, but he didn't sin. He didn't sin externally. He didn't sin in terms of the sins of commission, things he did, or the sins of omission, things that he didn't do. He didn't sin in motive. He didn't sin in thoughts. And so we've got the perfect fulfillment of the moral law by Jesus, exactly what he said he came to do. Then there is the prophetic fulfillment of the law. If we read the law and the prophets, even the Psalms, we see that there are hundreds of prophetic details that Jesus had to fulfill. Some people have kind of scoffed at this, saying, well, if there's a law about a king coming into Jerusalem on a donkey, all Jesus had to do was say, where's my donkey, so that I can go into the city of Jerusalem. But many of these details were outside of his own power to fulfill, like where he was born, or as a toddler being taken into Egypt. And when we add up the number of details that Jesus had to fulfill, the statistical odds are literally impossible. And so Jesus fulfilled the law morally, but also prophetically. Then there are a whole lot of themes that get developed in the Old Testament that Jesus had to fulfill. And Jesus says all of these themes are about me. So the bronze serpents in the book of Numbers, Jesus says, yeah, that's me. All right, the rock that Moses hit out of anger, Paul says, that was Jesus. Whether we look at the sacrificial system, the sacrifice itself, or the high priest, or the temple, or the tabernacle, Jesus says that's all about me. The nation of Israel, Jesus says, I am the nation of Israel. Very just interesting study for you. If you look at the events that happened early on in the life of Israel, and then you look at the events early on in the life of Jesus, you see such parallels, just absolutely mind-blowing. So Jesus is saying, I am the fulfillment of all of these themes, of all of these laws. The entire ceremonial system are all about me. And these are not going to go away until I personally have fulfilled every single prophetic detail, every single theme to the max. And so this is why the new covenant is all about Jesus. I often talk about the Old Testament versus the New Testament, but that word testament is a translation of a word which is the word covenant. So the Old Covenant is the covenant that God had with the nation of Israel. Jesus comes along, and the New Covenant is that he fulfilled all of these laws, all of these themes, all of these prophecies. And now in the New Covenant, every single one of us can engage directly with God in and through Jesus Christ according to the new, not the old covenant. The covenant in his blood accomplished by him on the cross, his death and resurrection. So maybe you ask, well, what role does the law fulfill in our lives now if we're in the new covenant and the old covenant was unique to the nation of Israel? Well, let's unpack that. But as we go through the New Testament, here's something you need to understand. Jesus was a Jew. His disciples were Jews. The earliest Christians were all Jews, and they understood themselves as a movement of fulfillment coming in and through Judaism. All right? Things got really complicated though when Gentiles started coming to faith. And so there are different sermons where sometimes sermons in the book of Acts are aimed at Gentiles, whereas other sermons are aimed at Jews. There are certain themes in the New Testament letters aimed at Jews versus Gentiles, or churches that were struggling with what do we do with Jews and Gentiles trying to worship in the same space. And so you and I would be making an interpretive mistake to leave that idea out, to kind of read these verses as being directly applicable to me without making the interpretive step. But actually, some of these letters were for very specific contexts. How do Jews deal with this new covenant? And how do Gentiles come into this picture? And what do we do with that? And how do we do church as a result of that? I mean, I don't know when the last time your church almost had a church split because of Jews and Gentiles struggling how to do this thing together. I don't know of any recent churches where that has happened. And yet we so often just blanketly apply these verses to us. So it is good for us to understand some of these teachings that were aimed more to the Jewish context and some of these teachings that were aimed more into the Gentile context. So let's talk about some of these teachings aimed at the Jewish context. And for that, probably one of the best books to look at is the book of Galatians. All right, they were a mixed church of Jews and Gentiles, and that is a major theme going through the book, but they were facing a very unique challenge. They had a group of Jewish people coming from Jerusalem with this so-called authority from the apostles. They were known as Judaizers, and they were Christians. They were believers in Jesus Christ, but they were trying to teach the churches that not only should they follow Christ, but in addition, they need to take on the entire Jewish law. And at the center of that teaching was that if you were male, you needed to be circumcised. So just follow Paul's logic here. He starts off in chapter 3 trying to show that even in the Old Testament, before we even get to Christ, salvation wasn't achieved by obeying the law. It was always through grace. Here's what he says, Galatians 3 verses 6. He's making this argument. He says, consider Abraham. He says, he believed God, and it was credited to him as righteousness. So how was Abraham saved? By obeying the law? I mean, he was around before the law, and yet he was saved because he believed God. And so then Paul starts to preempt some of the questions arising out of this. So he says here in chapter 3, verses 19, what then was the purpose of the law? The very same question you and I are asking. And so he answers that saying, it was added because of transgressions until the seed to whom the promise referred had come. So he says the reason for the law was for transgressions. I mean, if there were no laws, the nation of Israel would have fallen into chaos. So he says, because we need to control that chaos, the nation of Israel needed laws, but that was for a temporary season. He says it was added because of transgressions until something happened. What is that thing? Until the seed to whom the promise referred had come, and that is Jesus. And so he is agreeing with Jesus in Matthew 5, saying that now that I have come, I am fulfilling the law, and the law for the nation of Israel has played its role and is past. Here's another way that Paul talks about this a few verses later in chapter 3, verses 24 to 25. This is so important. He says, so the law, remember he's answering the question, why then did we have the law? So the law was put in charge to lead us to Christ, the fulfillment of the law, that we may be justified by faith, just like Abraham. Now that faith has come, faith in Christ, we are no longer under the supervision of the law. Now, maybe the NIV translation isn't the clearest one here. It says, so that the law was put in charge. Other translations will talk about the law being like a schoolmaster or a tutor. You know, in some countries, the way you get educated is you are living in an estate and the family will organize a tutor to come in and they're going to educate you and they're going to protect you. But the point is never to stay under the tutorage of the tutor. Eventually, you need to be trained so that you have autonomy and that you can kind of adult in this world and do life, and that you've been trained in responsibility. And Paul is saying that was the goal of the law. Now, this is not talking about your life, that you must live according to the law when you're little, so that when you're big, you can have faith in Christ. He's looking at the unfolding of salvation history, saying for then, the law was to kind of protect them and just protect them against chaos and transgressions. But now we have been led to Christ. The law has done its job, and therefore we don't need it anymore. Now, some people are saying, praise the Lord, hallelujah. Some people, for whatever reason, still have a tendency within them to want to follow the law. So maybe you're asking, well, can I maybe have a bit of law and a bit of Christ? Well, listen to how Paul addresses that question. He says, Galatians 5 verses 2-4, mark my words. I, Paul, tell you that if you let yourselves be circumcised, Christ will be of no value to you. Again, I declare to every man who lets himself be circumcised that he's obligated to obey the whole law. And we've shown that that is impossible. You who are trying to be justified by law have been alienated from Christ. You have fallen away from grace. Those are really harsh words. But Paul is saying, if you want some of the law, then you have to have all of the law. But if you want the law, you lose grace and you lose Christ. So there's a bit of a snapshot as to how people were trying to deal with this Jewish understanding of law versus Christ. Now let's try and understand more of a Gentile context. Again, the church started off very Jewish, but as the gospel went out and as people started getting saved, more and more Gentiles started to be saved. This was a concern for the early Jerusalem church. And so they had this big meeting with all the big players and all the big heavies, and they were debating, how exactly do we understand this? One of the people stood up and said, guys, how is it that we're trying to get Gentiles who have no prior commitment to the Old Testament law, how is it that we're trying to get them to obey and fulfill the law, whereas our own people weren't able to fulfill the law? And here is the conclusion. Acts 15 verses 19. It is my judgment, therefore, that we should not make it difficult for the Gentiles who are turning to God. And they conclude this meeting saying, no, Gentiles do not need to fulfill the law. You, for the most part, are a Gentile. Do you need to fulfill the law? And the answer is no. I heard someone say, I forget who I'm kind of quoting here, but they said it's kind of the difference between a 4D scan of your baby and the real baby. So we've got 2 kids, and on both occasions, on a number of times, we were able to see a scan of our child. And while you see it on the screen, you're able to see the child move. So powerful, so beautiful, such a gift. But then the time comes when the baby is born. Now imagine the baby is born. I mean, he or she is there. You get to see her, you get to know him or her, you get to love them. But imagine there's the mom loving on the baby and there's me staring at the 4D scan. Now, maybe that's fine for a few seconds, but eventually if I'm staring at the 4D scan and ignoring the baby, at some point the wife's going to say, "What are you doing? The baby's here." That's what's special for its time, but its role is finished. It's what's pointing towards the baby. And in the same way, by us going back to the law, we are going to a time where It's played a very unique role, but that role has been played out. It has been fulfilled by Christ. He is now here. And so our center of focus and understanding and relating to God is in and through Jesus, his teachings, and ultimately the person of Jesus and what he accomplished through his life, death, and resurrection. So if that's true, what do I do with the greater part of my Bible? Do I just take it out and put it on the side? Or do I still need to study it for today? How do I relate to this if I don't need to obey these laws? Well, here's a few ideas for you. And the first one is this: see how these laws point to Jesus. See how these laws point to Jesus. Now, maybe it's not always very clear to you, so you need a bit of a guide. I know when I go to the Kruger Park, I'm not going to always see what the guides see. And so they're going to be saying, look for that, look for that. Can you see this? They've got a different set of eyes that are trained. And in order for me to always see how these laws are fulfilled by Jesus, maybe I'm going to need some help, some guides, some literature. But as I engage in that and as I see how this is fulfilled by Jesus, that's going to be extremely edifying and useful to me. Number 2, let the law point out your sin. Paul says in Romans 7:13 that the law is going to sometimes help me recognize sin for what it is. Sometimes we sin and we're aware of it, but sometimes we sin and we're unaware of it. And it kind of works like this. I know when I first started driving, I had the kind of car that I could feel every rattle. So if I was going 60, I knew it. If I was going 120, I really knew all about it. But have you ever gone from driving a car like that into a car that is just a smooth ride? It's automatic and everything is so amazing. You're air conditioned and you've got this beautiful music playing. And so you're driving and you're waiting for the rattle of the car to let you know how fast you're going. And before you know it, you're going like 160. And then a cop jumps out in front of you and stops you. You see, the cop is saying to you, you didn't know it, but you were speeding. Can the cop fix you? Can the law save you? No. But sometimes we need the law just to help us see my sin and my brokenness. The law cannot fix me. It can point it out to me, but it's going to take me from there to the one who fulfilled the law, the one who fulfilled all the moral law and all the ceremonial law, Jesus Christ. And so I go to him for the change in the life and the transformation that I need to see. A third idea is this: look for the consistent principle in the law. I've already shown you that the context from then to now is so different. We make a mistake by trying to equate the two. The context of the nation of Israel, the context of the nation surrounding them has changed so much. But what hasn't changed is the nature of the lawgiver. And so while some laws doesn't make sense to me, what we can see is just how seriously God takes holiness, just how seriously God takes sin, just how seriously God takes justice and equality, how seriously God takes how we deal with poverty and for the least of those amongst us. That doesn't change from the Old to the New Testament. Even some of the food laws. So today, according to Jesus and according to the New Testament letters, I can thankfully eat my chorizo and prawn meal. However, I would be making a mistake to too quickly jump to this idea that I can eat whatever I want. When I look at the food laws in the Old Testament, the principle is God is saying what you eat matters. There's a health thing going on here. There's a holiness thing going on here. So when I import those principles into today, I can even go, man, as a Christian, I need to think about what I eat from a health perspective, from a wisdom perspective, who's around me. I need to be wise according to that, and also holiness. That's, for so many Christians, they only think about God every second or third Sunday because that's when they go to church. And yet these laws from the Old Testament governed every single second of their lives. And while those laws don't govern every single second of my life today, I'm still being invited to live a life where every single second of my life is for Christ and under Christ and for His glory. So these principles can be understood and accessed and can transform my life. Second last idea here is let the law serve as an example. Paul says in 1 Corinthians chapter 10 verses 6, these things occurred as examples to keep us from setting our hearts on evil things as they did. Remember, the law isn't only the laws, but these stories. And so when I read these stories, they are instructive. They guide me. They teach me. For example, the story of the golden calf. These people went straight from incredible experience of God's power, of God's presence, of God's freedom, and they went straight into idolatry. And so I get to ask of myself, how often do I do that? How often do I experience God and God's freedom in such a powerful way? And I say to myself, I will never fall into my old ways. And 1 week later, I'm doing exactly the same thing. These things happened for our benefit and they serve as examples to us. And finally, look for the themes that get carried from the law into the New Testament. Now, if you want someone to help you do that, again, sometimes we need some thinkers and some pastors who have gone before us and can help us see what maybe we don't always intuitively see. If I can just punt the Bible Project here, go listen to their podcast. They are brilliant at doing this. But really, we see these themes that they start on page 1 of Scripture, gets carried through and get developed throughout the whole Old Testament, find their fulfillment in Jesus, but they continue in and through their church. And we see this consummation in the book of Revelation. So whether we talk about us being made in the image of God, or the whole priesthood idea, or the Eden idea, or the Sabbath idea, we can pull on this thread and follow it all the way through. And we just get enriched by this. We get to see the beauty of God's plan, how Christ has fulfilled it, what we're being invited into, and we are better off for it. So please don't tear out the law. Please don't tear out your Old Testament and believe the idea that all we need is our New Testament. All of this is a fulfillment, a beautiful fulfillment of this. And so I want to end off with a quote by an Old Testament theologian, Christopher Wright. And he says, listen, instead of asking which laws can I fulfill, which laws shouldn't I fulfill, he said we should ask, what can I learn from all of these laws about how God wants me to live and how He wants His people and society at large to live? Not what rules do I have to keep, but rather what kind of relationship do I need to cultivate with God and live out among others. So to all of you out there, I'm hoping that this brings clarity. Guys, when it comes to certain people who are trying to, like the Judaizers were, trying to import the Old Testament law into our practices today, usually what they do is they ignore these major themes of Jesus, these very clear teachings of Jesus with regard to the law, of Paul with regard to the law. Jesus and Paul are in absolute 100% agreement, and they'll find some isolated verses, difficult to understand verses, often in the prophets, and then they get us into a state of confusion. Whereas what I propose we do is we look at what Jesus teaches very clearly, what Paul teaches very clearly, these themes that can be developed very clearly, and then go back to some of these obscure verses and interpret them in the light of the greater clarity. So I'm hoping that this is clear for you. I'm hoping this is freeing to you. I'm hoping that this helps you live your life better as a Christian under Christ and in the new covenant, and that we are really able to demonstrate the reality of God better in this world. God bless you in this.